The anticipation for J.D. Vance's appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had been building for weeks. The Ohio senator, best-selling author, and outspoken conservative was stepping into one of the most hostile media arenas imaginable. Colbert had built his reputation on dismantling right-wing figures with wit, sarcasm, and a knowing smirk that his audience ate up. Tonight, they expected a show. They expected their host to tear Vance apart, to reduce him to a series of viral sound bites that would make the rounds on social media. After all, many had tried to spar with Colbert before and ended up as little more than political punchlines. But Vance wasn't just another guest. He had built his career on being underestimated. He knew the rules of engagement, and tonight he had no intention of playing Colbert's game. As the opening monologue wrapped up, the studio buzzed with anticipation. The audience erupted in applause as Colbert grinned into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, my next guest is a senator, a venture capitalist, and amazingly, someone who still claims to be an outsider. Please welcome J.D. Vance. Vance strode onto the stage with confidence, shaking Colbert's hand before settling into his chair. The audience's reaction was mixed, polite applause, but an unmistakable air of skepticism. They expected to see another conservative squirm under the heat of Colbert's humor. Instead, they were about to witness something very different. Colbert leaned forward, his trademark smirk in place. "JD, thanks for coming. I have to say, I was reading your book, Hillbilly Elegy, which I assume you wrote before you became a full-fledged coastal elite." Laughter rippled through the audience. Vance chuckled but remained composed. "Well, Stephen, I did write it before I lived in Washington, but I think the struggles I wrote about are still very real. A lot of people in this country feel ignored, and they're still waiting for solutions." Colbert seized on the response. "Ah, yes, the forgotten people of America. That's an interesting way to put it, JD. But I have to ask, when did you decide that working-class folks needed a billionaire-funded think tank to tell them what they already know?" More laughter. Vance, however, didn't flinch. "Stephen, the real question is, why does it take a senator like me to remind Washington that these people exist in the first place?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the usual dance of mockery and deflection. Colbert leaned back slightly, but kept pushing. "Well, since you're here to remind us, let's talk about your party. You claim to stand for the working class, yet you align yourself with a party that seems more interested in tax cuts for the rich than in fixing real problems." Vance's eyes sharpened. "You know, Stephen, the people I grew up with don't care about political labels. They care about results. They want jobs, they want opportunities, and they want to be heard. If Washington had actually done something for them in the last 30 years, I wouldn't have had to get into politics at all." Scattered applause. Colbert raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to conservatives pushing back this effectively. "So you're saying both parties are at fault?" "Absolutely," Vance said without hesitation. "But the real question is, who's actually trying to fix it now?" Colbert hesitated, clearly caught off guard. He attempted a quick pivot. "You talk about fixing things, but let's be honest. Washington is a swamp, and you're part of it now. How do you justify criticizing it when you're neck deep in it yourself?" Vance leaned forward. "Simple. I didn't go to Washington to make friends. I went there to fight for people who feel forgotten. If that makes me unpopular in D.C., so be it." Another wave of applause, louder this time. Colbert, sensing the shift in momentum, forced a grin. "Okay, JD, but let's talk about transparency. Your party has been accused of suppressing the press, avoiding tough questions. Don't you think that's a problem?" Vance didn't miss a beat. "Stephen, let's talk about trust. Americans don't trust the media anymore because they don't believe they're getting the full story. If journalists spent more time listening to people outside of New York and D.C., maybe that trust could be rebuilt." Colbert let out a forced chuckle. "Oh, I see. So instead of journalists, we should just get our news from politicians?" "That's a bold strategy, JD." Vance smirked. "No, Stephen, we should get our news from people who don't distort facts to fit a narrative. If the media reported the truth instead of chasing clicks and outrage, maybe they'd be trusted again." The audience's laughter faltered slightly. Colbert crossed his arms, leaning back as if preparing to launch another attack. "Let's talk about your stance on immigration. You've supported strong border policies that many would say are too harsh, even cruel. How do you justify that? Vance nodded as if expecting the question. Stephen, let me ask you something. Do you lock your front door at night? Colbert blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Yes, JD, I do. Why? Vance asked simply. Colbert sighed, realizing where this was going. Because I don't want strangers walking into my house. Exactly, Vance said, leaning forward. America is our home. We want people to come in legally, through the front door, not sneak in through a window. Border security isn't cruelty, it's common sense. A low murmur spread through the audience. Some clapped. Colbert, sensing the momentum slipping, quickly tried to pivot. Okay, JD, but let's talk about democracy. You've been accused of supporting policies that undermine voting rights. Don't you think every American should have an equal say? Vance didn't blink. Every legal American already does, Stephen. What we're against is manipulation, ballot harvesting, voter fraud, systems that make elections less secure. Ensuring integrity in our elections isn't about suppression. It's about protecting democracy. The room fell silent for a moment. Colbert, clearly flustered, glanced at his notes. Well, JD, I have to give you a credit. You came prepared. Vance smiled. Stephen, I always do. The interview wrapped up with forced pleasantries, but everyone in the audience knew they had witnessed something unusual. A conservative guest who had walked into Colbert's studio, faced the gauntlet, and walked away unscathed. As J.D. Vance exited the stage, the cameras faded to black, leaving behind a rare silence. The expected takedown had never come. Instead, a different narrative emerged, one of conviction, resilience, and a refusal to play by the usual rules. And outside the studio, the conversation was only just beginning. Meanwhile, social media exploded. Clips of the interview spread like wildfire. Some praised Vance for standing his ground, while others accused Colbert of losing control. The debate raged online with commentators, journalists, and ordinary Americans dissecting every moment. Major news outlets picked up the story, running headlines that ranged from J.D. Vance stuns Colbert with calm, measured debate to Colbert's toughest interview yet. Hashtags like #Vance Colbert and #Late Night Showdown trended for hours. Podcasters, political analysts, and influencers on both sides of the spectrum weighed in. Conservative figures hailed the interview as a victory, while progressive commentators debated whether Colbert had underestimated his opponent. Viewership for the clip skyrocketed on YouTube, with reaction videos emerging within minutes. One thing was certain. Vance had dominated the conversation, and his performance would be discussed long after the show had ended.